Welcome to the Staffroom, a podcast which takes a look into the world of education. In this series, we chat to inspirational educators far and wide about pedagogy, shed light on great practice, and discuss new and exciting ideas. My name's Michael Royale, and I'm sitting here with Tessa Johnson, and we're coming to you from Corpus Christi College in Perth, Australia.
In this episode, we'll be talking about cognitive science and the powerful strategy retrieval practice. We'll be chatting to Assistant Professor, Cognitive Scientist and former teacher, Dr. Pooja Agarwal. Pooja is the founder of retrievalpractice.org and has published research of the power of retrieval practice and the way the strategy makes significant learning gains for students.
So I think of retrieval practice very simply getting information out. Research from cognitive science and cognitive psychology demonstrates that actually that process of getting information out improves our learning. So it's not just getting information out as a way to test what we know, but that retrieval actually changes what we know and it solidifies that. So when students engage in this, they're better able to remember information.
I'm Michael Royale.
And I'm Tessa Johnson.
And this is the Staffroom. All right, Tess, so today we're talking to Pooja, and that's going to be about retrieval practice. And we've actually spoken to Dr. Jana Weinstein about that in episode 7 from the first season. So what are you looking forward to with this one?
I'm really excited for this interview because I loved our interview with Dr. Jana Weinstein. I found everything she had to say on cognitive psychology so interesting, particularly actually retrieval practice. And so after we conducted that interview, I did sort of go into, because my year 12s were leading up to exams, and gave them some tables and experimented with retrieval practice. But again, I feel like because we covered so many different practices and so a variety of cognitive sort of science, we maybe only just skim the surface. So I'm looking forward, hopefully, Pooja, to talk to us about retrieval practice in a little bit more detail, and maybe as well a little bit more of the science behind why it is so effective. How about you, Mike?
Yeah, similar to you, but I suppose it would be really nice to actually have some concrete examples of how to use it in the classroom, because as you said, it's almost like we're just scratching the surface at the moment and almost not even realizing when we're using it. So just to have some ideas and strategies on how to actually use it in the classroom.
Yeah, no, I'm super excited. So let's get started.
Yeah, let's go.
Pooja Agarwal is a cognitive scientist and ex-teacher from Boston. Pooja is passionate about making retrieval practice a regular part of classroom practice and has set up retrievalpractice.org to make cognitive research more accessible and practical for teachers. Pooja joins us via Skype today to talk about her work, research, and why retrieval practice should be the most powerful tool in a teacher's toolkit. So hi Pooja, to get us started, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
I'm Pooja, and I'm a cognitive scientist, which means I do research on how people learn, and I'm also a teacher. So I currently teach college students. I started my career as an elementary school teacher, so I taught grades 4 and 5. In addition to doing a lot of research in classrooms and in laboratories on how people remember everything from vocabulary words to authentic classroom material.
Wonderful. And then what made you so interested in looking at sort of cognitive psychology and how students learn?
Oh, I love that. It was one of those light bulb moments, and I was always jealous when people would have light bulb moments. And I kind of had my own. In college, I was majoring in education and getting certified to be an elementary school teacher. And I loved those classes, and I was learning a lot, and I really enjoyed being in classrooms. And at the same time, I was majoring in sort of a combined psychology neuroscience program. And I took a class on cognitive psychology, and I had no idea what cognitive meant. And it ended up being a class all about learning and how people learn and pick up things even though they're not aware of it, and how we can improve learning. And so I was literally taking classes about the exact same thing, about learning in the classroom and learning from a scientific perspective, but even on the same campus, they didn't really seem to talk to each other. There's just this disconnect. And so that light bulb was thinking, wow, there's so much opportunity to take all this neat research and see how it applies in the classroom.
Yeah, fantastic. So we're going to talk to you today quite specifically on retrieval practice, which is sort of your bread and butter, I suppose. And we have spoken about retrieval. We've touched on retrieval practice in an earlier episode, but could you just tell us and remind our listeners as well what actually retrieval practice is?
So I think of retrieval practice very simply getting information out. And that could be a whole lot of different things, whether it's trying to remember where you parked your car or trying to remember what you ate for breakfast yesterday. And we often think about in educational contexts when we ask students, what did you learn? What did you remember? When we ask students to retrieve what they know, we're often doing that as assessment and exam. So, okay, you learned a bunch of stuff, you listened to a lecture. Now I want you to kind of output it, to retrieve it on a paper or on an exam. And research from cognitive science and cognitive psychology demonstrates that actually that process of getting information out improves our learning. So it's not just getting information out as a way to test what we know, but that retrieval actually changes what we know and it solidifies that. So when students engage in this, they're better able to remember information. So one example of a question we may not even think of as retrieval is what your least favorite ice cream flavor is. And so, Michael and Tessa, can you think of or retrieve your least favorite ice cream flavor?
Pistachio, well, easy. I hate pistachio.
Well, I was going to say, I have a nut allergy, so I'd probably go with pistachio or some sort of peanut flavored one as well. So there you go.
My least favorite is mint chocolate chip, which you both might really
That's our favorite.
Yeah. Right. And it's just a simple question. And outside the context of the classroom, that's retrieval practice. You know, you probably thought back to the one time you had pistachio ice cream and you really disliked it. And in the classroom, we can ask questions like, how old was King Tut when he became a pharaoh? Or what is photosynthesis? Those are all examples of what we think of as classroom learning, but it's all retrieval just the same way.
Do you think that retrieval practice is underused in the classroom by and large?
Oh, that is such a good question. I do think in the classroom we use it. And so I don't think it's a case where we can say, well, educators just don't use retrieval at all. I think we do. So in a simple sort of think, pair, share activity, students are thinking about what they know and they're sharing it. And that can be a form of retrieval, is to literally talk or almost teach something to someone else. I think the distinction is that we can do more with retrieval practice than we currently are. And there's evidence behind what we do and why it's successful. So with Think, Pair, Share, what we might do is have students think for 5 seconds. Okay, think about the definition of photosynthesis, and then we have them share it. But that doesn't mean that students have actually retrieved that information. They may have actually just thought about what they're doing for the weekend or thinking about anything else. And so we often have intentions to help students retrieve, and we might give mini quizzes students retrieve on exams, but there are ways based on this research to really ramp up the way students retrieve and the amount of retrieval in our teaching.
The question I was actually going to ask is, do you find it could be quite awkward, or are there instances where students aren't really willing to engage in the retrieval because potentially they haven't built the rapport with the student, with the teacher, or, you know, like sometimes in the classroom how there's almost crickets when you ask a question? Does that ever occur when it comes to retrieval practice?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
and I'm glad you asked that, because I think a large component of perhaps why we don't use retrieval practice and why students are hesitant goes back to this idea of we usually think of retrieval as assessment. And so the only time students retrieve might be on a high stakes midterm or final exam. So when they suddenly confront their learning, it's really uncomfortable. And I really love thinking about how we can take that negative approach or feeling to retrieval, how we can flip retrieval from a negative to a positive when it comes to students and when it comes to educators. So one big way is, again, with a lot of research to back this up, is to keep retrieval low or no stakes. So as opposed to a big midterm worth 50% of your grade and a final worth 50% of your grade, splitting up weekly quizzes can make things much lower stakes. So I give weekly quizzes with my college students, and they're only 2% of their grade because they kind of rack up points throughout the semester. And I ask questions like your least favorite ice cream flavor, or have you ever gone skydiving, to emphasize that retrieval can be something we do every day. So I think taking away that mystique, taking away that high stakes exam aspect, and really making it low stakes and fun to just think about what you already know can help build that support for students, that retrieval is not a bad thing.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. So just, getting rid of the stigma surrounding it, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So do you find that retrieval practice works better with older or younger students?
It works well for both. And so there's lots of research showing that retrieval practice works very well for college students, for example. And a lot of research from this field has been done with college students in laboratories on college campuses. And there's more and more research in college classrooms, which I am so excited about, demonstrating that simple quizzes or using clickers or online quizzes or asking questions broken up during lectures improves learning in STEM classrooms, for example. But there's more research also coming out and being published with preschoolers and with younger students, grades 1 through 4, that practicing spelling, for example, is much more beneficial than writing out a word over and over. And on the opposite end, there's really fun research from medical school, for example, where even practicing CPR, resuscitation, improves your learning much more than watching a lecture or watching someone else do it. So there's lots of research demonstrating that it's such a flexible, simple strategy to get information out that really improves learning for all students and even beyond the classroom for adults and older adults.
Awesome. Could you give our listeners some practical ways that they could implement retrieval practice strategies into their classrooms?
Yes, I am I'm a pragmatist. So
Yeah,
as much
great.
as I love the research, I also love thinking about, okay, how can we do this? And one aspect of retrieval practice I really enjoy talking about is that it doesn't have to take more class time, it doesn't have to take more prep time, and it doesn't have to take more grading time. So retrieval can really take 1 minute or less. Let's say, for instance, if you start a class on a Tuesday and you say, all right, here's everything we covered on Monday, well, you can simply change that to take 1 minute and write down something you remember from Monday. So suddenly you as the teacher aren't telling students what happened. Students are taking a minute for themselves to retrieve what happened. And we do this in a way without really thinking about it. So sometimes it just takes a little effort to look at how often am I trying to get information into students' heads when I can just ask something a different way to get it out. So another example I like is what many people are calling brain dumps, which I think is great, or the scientific term is free recall, where you simply ask students, write down everything you remember about ancient Egypt. And you could even do that as sort of a pre and a post. Write down everything you already know about ancient Egypt, and then students learn that chapter, and you ask them again, now write down everything you learned about ancient Egypt. And students really enjoy seeing the difference literally in front of them between what they used to know and what they know now. So those brain dumps can take a lot of time depending on the content you're teaching. So even just giving students 1 minute to write down what they can remember and then moving on with the lecture or the lesson helps break things up and helps demonstrate that retrieval, again, can be low stakes, a quick thing. And going back to the grading, one thing I love is when I do this in my own college classroom, and then I have my students hand me their papers. And I think this is hilarious because I'm not going to take their papers and I'm not going to grade it, and it's not for a grade. It's the act of retrieval, and they can keep it as notes. So I think some of those small practical strategies are actually much more valuable than revamping your entire course design.
I think as well that's great, and actually showing the kids that can be quite easy. And I sort of think in terms of workload, from a teacher's and a student's perspective, in terms of revision for a test or for an assessment, it's so easy, isn't it, just to pick up a textbook and to read and to highlight and to read over notes and things like that, and they think, but it's such an effort to actually think about it. But if you give them some good strategies, such as the brain dump, or even just, I know in English we've made a table before, haven't we? And we've got them to trying to fill out that table without any notes, without going back to their books at all. Because I think, it is really useful as a sort of a study strategy as well.
Yes. Yeah.
So in your guide to retrieval practice, you mentioned that feedback is also an important part of the process. Can you tell us about this?
There is a lot of research looking at feedback. And I think going back to your question, Michael, teachers use retrieval and teachers use feedback. Feedback is part of what we do in the classroom. And there are lots of ways to think about feedback. So should we give it immediately, or should it be delayed, or what should be included in it, or should it be individualized, and so on and so forth. And we in our field like to play around with and examine all the different ways feedback can be effective and how to build onto retrieval practice with it. And so with feedback, there are 2 points I really like to think about. One is that there's research demonstrating that retrieval practice without feedback improves learning more than no retrieval at all. So let's say a teacher's classroom where she has quick quizzes versus her classroom without quizzes. So there's still a benefit of retrieval without feedback, but then if you do give students feedback, you see an even bigger boost. And sometimes that benefit can double. So suddenly if that teacher gives quizzes but adds on feedback, that can make a big difference to later retention and later learning. And part of that is because it applies to sort of students suddenly being aware of their own learning, what we call metacognition. Students have now retrieved, they know what they know, and they may be surprised, wow, I really didn't know that as well as I thought, and feedback corrects that errors. It also helps solidify again what students get correct. So sometimes students think, well, I got it correct, so I don't need to study it anymore. But feedback for correct answers also improves learning. So it's one strategy I think of as kind of a power-up or a way of building onto retrieval practice. Students need to retrieve first in order for that feedback to be beneficial. Oh, and then my second point is that in general, from this research, there are 2 generalizations, I would say. One is that there doesn't seem to be a big distinction between whether you give feedback immediately after retrieval or delayed. And so then for me, that means to generalize, any feedback is better than none. So when it comes back to Tessa's question with practical strategies, I say do what works for you. And if that means immediate feedback, great. If that means delayed feedback, great. And we also know that the more information, the better. So elaborative feedback, the more detail you can give students, the bigger the effect on learning.
So are there any potential challenges for teachers when implementing retrieval practice, and do you think it does impact on workload?
I think it does not have to impact workload. So retrieval practice, especially if it's low stakes, should actually not involve grading at all. And I like that it's just such a basic principle of getting information out that even sort of winging it in the middle of class can work really well. So stopping again to say, all right, write down 2 things about how what you just learned applies to what you learned last week. And there's no need to necessarily draft those questions in advance if the conversation seems to be going a certain way, is to stop and ask some questions. Again, without collecting student papers, without grading it. One concern or one challenge is frequently when we worry, well, if I do all this retrieval stuff and all this feedback stuff, I'm not going to be able to cover as much content. And that I completely understand can be a challenge. One way I like to think about it is that retrieval practice actually saves time, because we know from research, we know from classroom practice that this idea of retrieval improves learning. It improves retention, so students forget less. The key is that you don't have to keep reteaching things. If students are engaging in retrieval and they're learning and remembering more, you'll save time because you don't have to keep saying, here's what we learned last week, or here's what we learned last semester. Students are better able to pick up on things. So in the long run, you may not be able to cover as much content, but students will remember more and they'll be able to apply it better than if you simply jam in as much content as possible.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the mantra that we notice quite often through this podcast, which is work smarter, not harder. So
Yes.
All for that. So next up, we're very excited about your upcoming book, Powerful Teaching, Unleash the Science of Learning. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
I am very excited about this book, and I am co-writing it with a veteran K-12 teacher, Patrice Bain. She and I have done research originally in her classroom, and then it kind of spread to her school and then her school district to do a lot of this research. So looking at quizzes versus not quizzes, quizzes with feedback versus without, and expanding to Spanish classrooms, social studies, math, English, science, and so on. So Patrice and I have known each other for a really long time, and it's such a great way to put all of this research and practical strategies into one place. And we're really aiming to incorporate examples from her classroom. She teaches 6th grade, and examples from my classrooms with college students, and a bit of the research, but really focusing on making it practical and specific. So it's got research, especially given my background as a scientist, and stories from our classrooms, and some of these practical examples like brain dumps or asking about 2 things. And so I really hope that it starts changing this approach and the way we think about evidence-based education. So like you had said, Michael, do educators use retrieval practice, or do people know about it or not know about it? And I hope we're able to span that bridge of, it's great if you already use it, here's how to use more of it. And if you've never heard of these basic principles like spacing or interleaving, here's what those principles are, and also how you can adapt them for your classroom.
Awesome. So finally, could you let us know where our listeners can find you online, and also where they could find a copy of your book when it's released?
The best place I hope you'll visit is retrievalpractice.org. And from going to that website, you can do a few things. I really hope you'd subscribe for the weekly email updates that I send. And those are short. I intend them to be about 1 minute or less. They sort of will say, here's what I'm going to, what we're going to mention this week, and then here's a giant button. So, here's a strategy on connection notebooks from James Lang. Here's a giant button to go learn more from his website and his resources. So I really like to use those updates to send along resources or people or research without having to slog through an entire website. So I hope listeners will subscribe there. There are also free downloads. So I have free guides. One guide, as Michael mentioned, about retrieval practice, one about transfer. So how retrieval improves students' transfer of learning, not just memorization, but transfer to new contexts, higher order thinking. I've got a guide on that. A guide on interleaving, which is another principle from cognitive psychology. I've got 2 more coming. So those are all free. You can download those, and then I've got recommendations about other books, research, other guides, other websites and blogs to check out. So retrievalpractice.org would be the best place to find me. And in terms of the book, there should be pre-orders available later this year. And if you subscribe for those email updates, you'll definitely be notified about when that book comes out and where it's available. But it should be on Amazon and online and in local bookstores too.
And when were you estimating that you will be able to release the book?
Yes, the book, Powerful Teaching Again, should be out in June of 2019.
Excellent. So next winter for
Yeah.
us. Summer for you
Yeah,
guys.
for you guys. All right. Thank you so much, Pooja. That was fantastic. It was very insightful, and there's a lot that we and obviously our listeners can take away from that.
A lot of practical information as well. Super easy stuff that I could just go to this afternoon if I wanted to.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. Well, thank you again for having me.
Thanks again, Pooja. And enjoy the rest of your night, I suppose, over in...
Yeah.
Yes.
We've got a long school day ahead of us.
and stay away from that pistachio ice cream for both of you.
Yeah,
Especially
no.
me.
No, I have no problem doing that.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
Thank
See ya.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, Tess. So we've just spoken to Pooja, and I was wondering what you thought of that. So what are some takeaways you got from that interview?
Yeah, so awesome interview. Fantastic way to start the morning. I think as well, whenever I hear about retrieval practice, I sort of, I question the way that I teach, and I also question the way that I and my students learn. And I think, that notion of the brain dump and just quick quizzes, I got to do more of that in my classroom. It is so easy to do. It's not time consuming. And I think we all sort of just naturally do like to resort back to, okay, read over your notes. You've made these notes, may as well read over them. But I don't know if that is working smarter, not harder. So, yeah, fantastic to hear the science behind it as well. And, yeah, I'm definitely going to try and apply some more of this into my teaching. How about you, Mike?
I totally agree. Like, it's something that will be so easy to implement into our teaching practice. But I suppose it's one of those things that us as teachers, or I suppose even human beings, we just find it so easy to default back into what we think or know works. So it'll just be slowly implementing it into your practice and realizing the benefits of it. So I thought it was really important that she unpacked what those benefits are, and like you said, looking at the science behind it.
Yeah, and I think there is always that worry, when you ask a class a question that none of them will answer. But I think if you create that culture and that expectation that you are going to ask questions, and they are going to have to really think about it and pull out the answers, then you're going to get hopefully less crickets.
Yeah, exactly.
Over time.
Thank you so much for listening to The Staffroom, and thanks to our guest, Dr. Pooja Agarwal. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, my handle is Michael_Royale, and Tessa's is Tessa_Johnson too.
Please make sure you subscribe to our podcast on either iTunes or Stitcher, and feel free to leave a review and give us any feedback on the show. Listen out for our next episode of The Staffroom, which will be available shortly.
I'm Michael Royale.
And I'm Tessa Johnson.
Thanks for listening.